Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar sponsored by the American Sheep Industry Association. This evening's webinar is titled Understanding Sheep Nutrition. My name is Jay Parsons. I'll be your host and moderator, and we're very pleased to have Dr. Dan Moracle of Iowa State University here with us this evening to make the presentation. I'd like to start by thanking the American Sheep Industry Association and specifically the Rebuild the Sheep Inventory Committee for providing funding for this evening's webinar and for all of our webinars, and invite you to visit their website at growourflock.org, where they have links to recordings for all of our webinars, including this evening's webinar will be posted up there in a few days, and a lot of other resources for you to draw from, especially for those of you that are just getting started in the sheep industry. Also invite you to visit the American Sheep Industry Association website. For those of you that are unfamiliar with that association, it's at sheepusa.org. A lot of good resources there for people to draw from. A couple of housekeeping things. Our presentation should last about 45 minutes or so, leaving plenty of time for questions. Dr. Moracle has agreed to entertain questions both during and after his presentation, so I invite you to submit those in one of two ways. You can type your questions into the question box, which should be at the lower portion of your control panel, or you can also ask them verbally by raising your hand, and then I can call on you and unmute your microphone, and you can talk directly to Dr. Moracle. If you do choose to do that, I do want to remind you that you do have to actually have a microphone or have called in on the phone line and used your PIN number in order to have audio that way. So with that, I think we are ready to go ahead and get started, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Moracle, a sheep extension specialist at Iowa State University. Dr. Moracle is one of our leading experts on sheep nutrition in this country and throughout the world, and very pleased to have him here this evening. So understanding sheep nutrition is tonight's topic, and Dr. Dan Moracle, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Jay. First of all, it's a pleasure to talk to you tonight via the webinar. This is definitely not my most favorite way of presenting, because usually I like to interact more with people, so I'm going to count on you guys to ask me questions, because otherwise I never get to catch my breath because I talk pretty fast. I grew up in Indiana. I was on the Purdue judging team way back when. I did my graduate work at New Mexico State in reproduction with Jack Ruddle. And then I was with Herman Kiesling on my PhD in ruminant nutrition. And I've been at Iowa State since 1984, so yes, I'm getting to be an old, fart, gray-haired, long-in-the-tooth guy. If I can make this work. Now, and there we go. So here's my information, my phone number and my email. If you need to contact, follow up, have further questions, we don't get them answered tonight, you can send those to Jay or send them to me directly, and we'll get those sent back out to you, put them back up on the file. So we think about what's the best thing to feed sheep. Most of us, many of us might reply alfalfa or alfalfa hay. From my experience, sheep really like alfalfa. It's a really good feed. It's high in protein. It's high in energy. They like the leaves a lot better than they like the stems. So I think we have to be careful not to feed them too much. For those of you that are wondering, that's not a picture of Iowa. We don't have hills nearly that big in Iowa. That's from the James Ranch in Oregon. I put that picture in because they used to fertilize that with buggies. And if they can fertilize, we could do the same thing here in Iowa. So, but if we think about, hey, what we feed sheep, maybe the most desirable thing to feed them is just to let them graze, because that's their natural activity. They are ruminants, so they can digest that forage. As we think about feeding sheep, I've got a picture there of a semi-load that's being dumped in an alleyway there of wet distiller's grains that just came from the mill. That stuff's about 130 degrees. comes about 25 tons in the semi-load. Obviously, that stuff would spoil pretty quick if I've only got 30 or 40 ewes. I can't use that feed stuff in my feeding program, even though it's really good feed. It's pretty economical feed. The bottom left picture shows my sheep production class. We were on a field trip to northwest Iowa. The gentleman hosting us that day is Tyson Rule. They run about 2,000 ewes. We're standing in the commodity shed. You can see the feed truck in the back. Again, utilizing resources to feed those ewes in a very economical and quick way. The picture on the right is the ISU sheep farm. We use big round bales to feed ewes. I don't like them. They waste too much if you're not careful. And obviously, if we don't have the equipment, we can't get the hay to the sheep to start with. So we have to know what size our operation is, how much equipment we have for moving feed, TMRs, etc., when we go to trying to feed these sheep. The two pictures I have on the slide next are some pictures I took in the UK. They like to spend a lot of money on those fancy feeds. This was at the sheep event. That's rolled steamed corn on the top. It says pedigree mash on the bottom, and it looked like granola to me. But if we look at a feed tag, most of the time it'll talk about a 16% grower maybe. And when we're talking about that grower, that really is talking about the crude protein content of the feed. Unfortunately, the most important nutrient for our sheep is probably energy. And the tag does not say anything about how much energy is in that bag of feed. You can get some indication about energy levels via crude fiber. Obviously, the more crude fiber there is in that feed, the more roughage that's in that diet, the lower the energy level. So in many cases, a 14% finisher, which would be a little lower in protein, may just be as good as the 16% crude protein, depending on what you're feeding it to. For example, if we're using alfalfa hay already, we've got a high-protein diet. We may be able to get by with just feeding shell corn with those sheep to meet their nutrient requirements. Feed tags list items on an as-fed basis, so in reality that 16% grower is probably about 17.6% on a dry matter basis. If we look at reading the feed tag, feed tags are controlled by each individual state, and here is what it looks like on a guaranteed analysis for a trace mineral salt. So obviously salt is the main ingredient. It's between 94 and 95% of that particular bag. Zinc is next, then magnesium, manganese, iron, iodine, cobalt, and selenium. The one thing that's not listed on there that we might want to put on there would be sodium molybdate or molybdenum to help with copper problems if that's a problem like it is here in the Midwest or in Iowa. Trace mineral salt is mostly salt, and that's what the sheep crave. That's what makes them eat the mineral. And so in this case, this particular diet, the only thing that concerns me on it is that it's short on iodine. In that it's about 100 parts per million, and it needs to be at least 150, assuming their intake. And as we think about this, it's one thing to know how much the nutrient density is in the feed and the mineral, but if the sheep don't eat it, then that doesn't do us any good. So it's a matter of intake and concentrations of the nutrient. Then the next thing you'll see on the ingredient label will be or on the feed label will be the ingredients. Salt's listed first because it's the most prevalent. They're listed in order of what they're in that diet, and you can see that sodium molybdate now shows up. It just didn't have to be on the guaranteed analysis. So for those of you that are in states where copper can be a problem, you'd want to look and make sure there's no copper on your sheep mineral. And then lastly, on all the feed tags, it'll have feeding directions. And on this one, this trace mineral salt can be fed free choice. Do not permit excess consumption because selenium intake is controlled by FDA. And this is set such that with 1/4 of an ounce of intake, the ewes are getting the maximum FDA allowed selenium intake. So in some cases, when we think about some diets, if some is good, more is better. Selenium can be toxic, so we got to be careful not to overfeed selenium. So when we think about feeds, what's in a feed stuff? When we go out, we get that bucket of corn. It's got probably about 10 to 12% water in that feed. If you're feeding high moisture grain, it's probably 25% moisture. If you're feeding haylage, it may be 45 to 50% moisture. And all that means is we just got to feed more total pounds per day because there's a lot of water there. And we have the water content up to 80%, and that would be typical of what we would see with our spring forages that are really lush, really wet, really juicy. And as I got a question earlier today about feeding hay year-round to sheep even when they're on pasture, they may crave some hay to have something to chew on because that really wet, washy feed goes through them too fast. The mineral content of most feeds is around 1 to 4%. As you get higher than that, you're probably getting into feedstuffs where we raked up too much dirt. Got too much dirt splashed up on the base of the corn plant when we cut corn silage. When we think about energy values in the sheep industry, we normally use TDN, or total digestible nutrients. That's a form of quantifying the energy density of a feed. Corn is my preferred feedstuff here in Iowa. I don't get paid by the Corn Board, but that's my preferred feed. It's virtually no waste. It's 77% TDN. So it's almost pure energy. Whereas hays run in that 50 to 60% TDN value, and they tend to be a lot more variable in their energy content. Protein content of feeds runs from 5 to 8%. Normally we list it as crude protein, and that's simply the percent nitrogen in the feed times 6.25. And as we get to vitamins, we got A, D, and E and K. Those are what we call fat-soluble. The B vitamins, we really don't worry about that in the sheep business because we have the animals we're feeding are ruminants. The bacteria that live in the sheep's rumen produce their own B vitamins, and the sheep lives off that bacterial protein that synthesizes the B vitamins, so we have a source of those. And then the sheep can also make vitamin C. And as you'll notice, I didn't talk much about minerals other than the content, but we have two different kinds of minerals. We have what we call our macro minerals, things like calcium and phosphorus. We worry about that with urinary calculi. Iron, we really don't ever worry about feeding iron to sheep because there's a lot of feedstuffs from the dirt we contaminate the feed with. Sulfur and got to go magnesium, I think, are the other ones on the macros. Then when we get to the micro minerals, we're thinking about things like sodium and chloride, which we get from salt, selenium, which I've already mentioned, but then zinc, manganese, cobalt, iodine, which is one of the minerals I'll spend a lot more time on at the end of this presentation. Here's an example of a feed survey, hay quality survey we did in 1994, showing the variability that we can have in these hays. For example, the first one is first cutting grass hay. It averages 11.6% crude protein in Iowa, which would be mostly cool season grasses. But the range was 6 to 20, a threefold difference in protein content of those grass hays. The average energy value was 55% TDN, so really pretty good energy density, but the range was, again, 47 to 67. Whereas if we think about corn, corn might vary from 86 to 88% TDN. And most of the grains are very similar. We might get into some light test weight oats that might be a little lower. But in general, TDN and forages is going to be much more variable. I think the other thing I want you to understand from this slide set, we tend to think that legumes or alfalfa is the only thing we can feed. But if we put hay up in the right stage of maturity, it is very good in terms of its protein and its energy density. and works very well to feed sheep, and they don't waste a lot if we control how much we give them per day. When we think about what we should feed our ewes, feed our lambs, the first thing that's important to me is cost. Because feed costs are 50% of our cost of production in the sheep business, so we got to deal with cost of what we buy. And then we look at the nutrient density, which we already showed you on the previous slide with the variation in protein and energy content. Feeding waste is important to us because if they don't eat it and we use it for bedding, it gets to be very expensive. Now, there is no best feed for sheep. There can be the cheapest feed for sheep, and sometimes some of that junk hay that nobody else will buy is really cheap. But if the ewes waste 50% of it because they don't like it, then it's not cheap. But we can feed soybean hulls, which are, I got to know more specifically when we talk fodder. Are we talking corn fodder? I assume corn stalk bales, etc. I have a lot of experience with that, but I want a clarification on what that is for sure. Okay, so if they can elaborate a little more on what kind of fodder they're talking about. Soybean hulls are the outside of the seed coat. They're a very digestible fiber source. They work very well for sheep. Sheep really love them. It's a great diet to transition lambs onto when they come off pasture or range land and haven't been bump broke, because we don't have to worry about acidosis. Ewes will tend to overeat on them and choke. Barley fodder grown hydroponically. That's going to be a pretty immature feed, so it'll be on the higher end of the energy values. Because I don't have a lot of experience with it, I think what you need to do is get that tested, analyzed by a feed store, feed company. Testing lab will cost you $15 to $30, and it's money well spent. And again, back to shelled corn is probably my favorite feed. I've been accused of working for the Iowa Corn Board, but that's not the case. It's just really efficient, really easy. Some people ask me whether or not you should need to process that shelled corn. The sheep have a really good grinding mechanism with their molars. We really don't need to feed a ground corn unless we're trying to mix other things with it, like limestone or some other feeds to keep them mixed together. So it's more a particle size in terms of getting it done. Complete feeds that you buy in a bag, pelleted ration. The challenge with those is you don't really know what's in that ingredient. It says on the label it's 16% crude protein, but it could be sawdust and urea potentially and still be 16% crude protein and virtually no digestibility, no energy density. So complete feeds, pelleted diets, one of the things with pellets, lambs can't sort, ewes can't sort. They tend to eat it all, very little waste, but it costs a lot of money to run that feed through the pellet dye. To get it pelleted, probably talking $30, $40 a ton, so it could increase your feed cost today 10% at least to pelleted diet.
Hey Dan, if I could interrupt right here, we have several people that have sent in questions regarding dried distillers grains.
Okay.
Let me just give you a couple of them, and then one person has their hand up, and I'll go ahead and unmute their microphone here in a second.
All right.
But one of them has to do with how can you calculate how much protein your flock is getting from brewer's grain?
Okay. When you talk brewer's grain, I assume we're talking stuff that you get from a local brewery?
Yeah.
Okay. Ballpark, I'm going to guess it's about 25% crude protein. Okay?
Okay. Let's see. Okay.
And I'm saying that because corn is 7 to 8% crude protein. It's about 2/3 starch. When you process it to make the beer, make the alcohol, you take that starch out. The yeast is digest it, utilize it, and that's what they make alcohol with. So that leaves what's left. So if you triple that 7%, you get up to that 21, 25% crude protein. The distillers we have out of the ethanol plants in the Midwest runs about 28% crude protein.
Okay, and following up on that, another person asked about feeding distillers grains, what would be a range of percentage in the total feed ration? Do you have any advice on that?
Okay. The real concern, there's two concerns with feeding dry distillers grains, or wet distillers grains for that matter. The calcium-phosphorus ratio is really screwed up because we've taken the starch out, so we've made the phosphorus level even higher. So the risk of urinary calculi in feedlot lambs or in our stud rams is pretty high. And secondly, we can get into too much sulfur. And so when we have a high sulfur diet, we can create problems with polio, encephalomachia, or thiamine deficiency, or commonly referred to as brainers, because the sulfur ties up thiamine in the rumen and they're short on thiamine. So to be safe, 30% is kind of my maximum distiller's guideline. But if you get a good enough buy, you can feed a lot more. You just got to be more careful. Or maybe have a bottle of thiamine so you're ready to inject the polio sheet. Okay?
Okay. Thank you for taking the time to address those.
No problem.
Okay.
You guys would really be impressed watching me do this talk, and I've still got to move my hands to give my presentation like I normally do. So the next step is how much the sheep will eat per day. If we're thinking about nutrition, balance in the diet, ewes, mature sheep are going to eat 2 to 5% of their body weight. The lactating ewes eat more. They've got a higher metabolic rate. And ewes with 2 lambs eat more than a ewe with a single, and ewes with 3 or 4 lambs eat even more. So a ewe with triplets probably can eat 4.5 to 5% of her body weight. Lambs eat about 3 to 6% of their body weight. And as they get older, bigger, heavier, the percent intake down. So for example, I've got 50-pound lambs eat 4 to 5% of their body weight. So right at 2 pounds, 130-pound lamb might eat 3.5% of his body weight. So he might eat almost 5 pounds a day, but he doesn't eat as high a percentage of his body weight per day. So they tend to get lower as they get heavier as in terms of percent of intake. So that gives you an idea what you can expect sheep to eat. So if you put a big round bale of hay out there, they're going to eat full-fed. All they can eat, ewes are going to eat about 2.5 to 3% of their body weight, depending on how good that hay is. Okay, now this isn't a great picture, and I apologize for that, but the ewe on the left is what I call skinny. Condition score 1. The ewe in the middle, I call her condition score 2.5. And the ewe on the right, I call her a condition score 3 to 3.5, or probably 3.5 to 4. And so as shepherds, we need to monitor that body condition score on our sheep. Are they gaining weight? Are they losing weight? Are they losing condition? Because that is what can tell us whether or not we're feeding enough energy to meet their needs. And as we look at condition score, it takes about 11% body weight change to change a body condition score. So to take them from a condition score 3, which is average, to a fat condition, a 200-pound ewe has got to gain 22 pounds. So obviously if we bring them in off of corn stalks in November and they're all condition score 2s, on a lamb in a month, and you got to put 33 to 44 pounds on them. You can't do that with just hay, and so we got to be careful not to let these sheep get too far out of condition. Okay, this is a chart from the sheep NRC looking at their nutrient requirements of ewes. In this particular example, I've got ewes in maintenance, stage of production, because obviously the stage of production of sheep then determines how much she needs. We are kind of already talked about that. Lactating ewes have the highest energy, highest protein needs. Whereas during maintenance, if she's just in the summer, she's dry, you wean her off, she's kicked back, she's not doing anything, she doesn't need much feed, she doesn't need much energy. The yellow numbers, I hope they're yellow on your screen. That's a 175-pound ewe. Says she'll eat about 2.9 pounds a day. needs 1.6 pounds of TDN, 0.28 pounds of crude protein, and then she needs 2.9 grams of calcium, 2.7 grams of phosphorus. Vitamin A is 3,600 international units. Vitamin E is 20 international units. So back to TDN, again, is total digestible nutrients. For those that don't know, 454 grams equals a pound. IU stands for international units, and this came out of the 1985 Sheep NRC because it's a little simpler and easier for me to put on this. So we take that chart, and we know our ewes weigh 175 pounds. She needs 1.62 pounds of TDN and 0.2 pounds of crude protein. So if I've got alfalfa hay that's 50% TDN, it's not really good alfalfa hay. It's maybe first cutting got put up late. I can calculate how much hay that ewe needs to meet her energy requirements by taking 1.62, dividing that by 0.5, because every pound of hay has a half a pound of TDN. So that says that 175-pound ewe, to meet her energy requirements, needs to only eat 3.2 pounds a day. But she maybe could eat 5. So if I only feed her 3.2, she is not happy. She is screaming at me when I come out the back door, but she is maintaining her body condition, so we don't care. And at 3.2 pounds of TDN, or meter energy, if it's 16% crude protein, that's a half a pound of crude protein. And we only needed to feed that ewe 0.28 pounds, so she's got plenty of crude protein. And I have a note there, Sheep Brand Software. We sell 2 different Sheep Brands ration balancing software programs here at Iowa State University. I have that brochure on my webpage, so if you went after tonight, if you want to get that software, there's a producer version that costs $100. You don't have to save much feed to make that work. And there's a professional version that's $450. So that's my sales pitch for the night. So what's our cheapest feed source? For me in Iowa, it is corn. We're down to about $3.50 a bushel. Could get to $3.25, $3 this fall. They're talking about basis differences in North Dakota because they're too far away from the railroad tracks and the river of almost $1. Their corn price could get to $2.50. So we could have some really cheap corn in some of the perimeters of the Corn Belt this summer or this fall. And obviously, because it's so energy dense, you don't need to feed much. The sheep definitely don't waste it. Now, you do have to worry about creating acidosis, enterotoxemia by giving them too much corn too fast, but that's another issue that I'm sure we all understand not to do. Because we got to let those bacteria and microbes get adapted to the starch. So when we think about feeding these ewes, stages of production in an intensive system, we've got maintenance, which I call from weaning to 14 days pre-breeding, so that's about 138 days of the year. Almost over a third of the year, those ewes aren't producing. Ideally, we'd have them out on pasture, so it's low cost, no input. If we're feeding them in dry lot, then we've got to have some really cheap feed to get them through as cheap as possible. Flushing breeding is a time prior to putting the rams in. We want those ewes gaining weight, body condition, so they ovulate more eggs, try to get more lambs born. Flushing will generate about a 10% increase in your drop rate, assuming the ewes aren't already obese. If your ewes are fat, they won't respond to flushing. So ideally, you'd want them right at a 2.5 body condition score, somewhere between that ewe on the left and the ewe in the middle. And then they'll respond. And I only breed for 35 days, 2 estrus cycles, because that makes my management during late gestation and lambing a lot better. Early mid-gestation is from the end of breeding till 4 weeks pre-lambing, so it's about 80 days. Concerns during early mid-gestation. In the past, we've said we don't have to worry too much about those ewes at that time. We can let them lose a little weight. But there are some concerns that with 21 days of severe underfeeding or 80 days of moderate underfeeding, both of those will result in reduced placental development. And we got to realize the placenta is how the embryos and fetuses get their nutrition. The bigger the placenta is, hopefully the more ideal the birth weights, plus we tend to get more stimulation of the udder to be larger and milk better. So we've got to be careful during that mid-gestation time period not to short those sheep too much. Our goals at that time are to maintain condition on the mature ewes. We've done some work with fetal loss in some yearlings and 2-year-olds. They tended to lose more fetuses. We ran them with the mature ewes. So I would try to make sure those ewes were kept in better condition. Maybe especially if you were thinking about running them on corn stalks or some rough ground to stretch them. Maybe those younger ewes you bring in and put on feed quicker. From a specific nutrient, we worry a little bit about protein and some other species. Protein deficiency impacts placental development much more so than energy. And so if we think about grazing corn stalks, dormant range, it may be low enough in protein that we need to supplement. Many of us in the Midwest, we've got more corn crop acres and crop residue to graze than we got sheep. So because of selective grazing, they may or may not be protein deficient. We get to late gestation, and to me that's the critical time period. We've got rapid fetal growth. For singles, we need to really get the ewes up on better feed for a couple weeks. Twins, 3 to 4 weeks out. And if I knew my ewes had triplets in them, I'd put them on better feed 4 to 6 weeks ahead of lambing. Now, that sounds really simple except for the fact that we bred over 35 days. So now my 4 to 6 weeks is actually 9 to 15 weeks. So depending on when they start, when they lamb. Early lactation is the most important time in the ewe's production. That's when she's generating some lamb growth for us. Ewes peak at about 40 or 21 days of lactation, and by day 42 they start going back down. Late gestation in an intensive system, we try to wean these ewes at 70 days or so. Our weaning ration is really critical in terms of trying to prevent problems with mastitis. So we like to pull them off energy and protein, wheat straw, oat straw, soybean stubble are really good feeds to dry ewes up. They won't eat it anyway. Cutting back on that diet the week before weaning, keep them on that transition drying up diet for a week after weaning if possible, just to try to minimize mastitis. Now, if we're weaning at 4 or 5 months of age on the lambs, that ewe's milk production is already way off, pretty well dispersed anyway, so we don't have to be near as careful with mastitis in those ewes. When we think about late gestation feeding, if we're on an alfalfa hay-based roughage source, hay source, we could use barley or other economical energy sources. Basically, I feed about 1 pound of concentrate per fetus. So twin ewes will get 2 pounds. Mature ewes with 3 or more fetuses, I try to limit their roughage intake to limit vaginal prolapses. And my ewe lambs in a commercial flock, we were running a set of Romanoff, Polypay, East Friesians, dropping almost a 200% lamb crop out of ewe lambs. So I always restrict their roughage intake, trying to prevent problems with vaginal prolapses, getting those ewe lambs too full. If we're feeding low-quality roughages, maybe corn stalks is all we can have. Side ditch hay for some of those people out west that I saw baling this summer as I drove across Nebraska and South Dakota. If it's mature, lower energy, we need to supplement both protein and energy in late gestation. Because if we have diets that are low and or poor roughages, we could respond to escape protein or what we call UIP, integrated intake protein, even though they're really expensive. Late gestation is when that udder develops. We need to feed the ewes for that. The larger the placenta, as we talked about during mid-gestation, the more placental lactogen we get, so that stimulates that udder development. Ewes that drop multiples have a larger placental weight, so they are ready to produce milk to feed the multiples. Underfeeding in late gestation can lead to weak lambs, small lambs at birth, and if the lambs are small, we get into high mortality. Ewes will have poor colostrum quality and quantity, which again goes back to lambs that don't do as well. Small lambs don't grow as fast post-weaning, pre-weaning. If that ewe is thin at lambing time, she's not going to peak as high on milk yield, and she'll have less total milk production. And if she doesn't milk, the lambs don't grow as fast. And if you're in an accelerated system, if those ewes get too thin because they started too thin, you're not going to get them to breed back. And lastly, on fetuses that develop under a low energy situation in late gestation, the development of secondary follicles is not as great. Therefore, their long-term, lifetime, annual wool production is also decreased. Dan, what happened to them in late gestation? Sure.
Hey, we do have one question from the audience. Nara, you have your hand up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone. Nara, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Got a question about de-oil distillers dried grains. What is the difference between de-oil distillers dried grains and DDGS? How different is in fat?
Okay, what's the first product?
DDGS, you know, they have reduced...
Yes, dried distillers grains with solubles.
And the other one is they have reduced the fat content.
Yes.
How different are these products?
Okay, so, and I own a few ethanol shares. And our plant takes the fat out. And so instead of being 10% fat, we get it down to about 6%. So when you have distillers that's got less fat, it's got less energy. Okay, so it's probably, instead of 80% TDN, it might be 75% TDN. So as they've taken more fat out, it's not as good a feed from an energy basis. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Now, the real challenge with the ethanol and all the byproducts of the ethanol plants is they're still changing them all the time. So what you may have bought a year ago from the ethanol plant, they may have changed their process. They may be taking more fat out today than they were a year ago. So you need to ask some of those questions, what the guaranteed analysis is. They'll tell you what their fat level is because they know. Because it's worth a lot more to take the fat out and sell it as corn oil than it is. Okay. Am I here? All right. I assume I'm still good, so I'm going to keep going. Consequences of overfeeding the ewes in late gestation. One, it will impact your wallet. It will make fat ewes, and there is an upper limit on birth weight. My goal would be for singles to weigh about 7% of the ewe's body weight, maybe 6.5. I want twins to weigh right at 6 to 6.5% of the ewe's body weight, and that's her body weight when she's open prior to going into breeding in average body condition. And triplets, I'd like for them to weigh about 5%. So I want, if I have a 200-pound ewe, I want her to have 10-pound triplets, 30 total pounds of lamb. Because the more mass I get in the baby lambs, the better off they can handle cold stress, the higher their survival is. But I don't. We think about milk production in sheep, the energy status of the lactation ration. Basically what that says is if those ewes are losing body weight, and almost every ewe loses weight during lactation, at least early lactation, that says she's on an energy deficient diet. That costs us about 10% in terms of weaning weight because the ewes lose weight. They don't milk to their maximum. If the diet doesn't have enough protein, they also will have reduced production, and it takes both energy and protein to make milk. If they're not in condition to milk, when they lamb, we've got some trouble. And obviously, as we talked about already, if they're dropping twins and triplets, there's a bigger placenta, there's more placental lactogen that stimulates more udder development, and those ewes are pre-programmed to milk heavier. All right, so what's a highly productive ewe? That's a ewe, to me, a mature ewe that produces at least twins or better. She raises everything she drops. She produces 7.5 pounds of milk per day. And I figure that because my way to think about that is it takes 5 pounds of milk, ewe milk, to get a pound of lamb gain. So if she's producing 7.5 pounds of milk per day, that means her twin lambs will be gaining 0.75 pounds each. I want her to be long-lived so I don't have to keep replacements back as much. I want her to breed back if I'm in an accelerated program, and she needs to eat like a horse when she's lactating. The rest of the year, I just assumed she didn't eat anything because I want to try to save on feed costs. Ewe lambs, I want them to lamb at 12 to 14 months of age. And as a group, I'd like for them to drop at least 150%. And you guys are all going, this guy is nuts. I want all my ewe lambs to drop 1 because that's all they can raise. They can't count to 2. But if they only drop 1 as ewe lambs, they're only going to drop about 1/6 as mature ewes. And I want to be in that 200 plus on mature ewes, 240. So I want my ewe lambs to have twins, and that makes them easy to manage as well. If I have 150% drop, I've got half singles, half twins. I've got to have 2 different groups. And again, back to production, ewe lambs should produce at least 4 pounds of milk a day, which means their twin lambs will gain 0.4 or from birth to weaning. In a single, it'll do 0.8. Feeding management, separate by need, singles versus twins versus triplets, levels of production, ewe lambs versus mature ewes should always be kept separate. Early, late lambers, that's why I only breed for 35 days because I hate late lambers. They tend to get very fat on us, big birth weights, singles, etc. The way to get rid of late lambers is to call them or sell them to somebody else. It's kind of like those cows that all of a sudden became fall calving cows because they couldn't breed during the normal breeding season. Okay, I've got 2 slides of rations for a 175-pound ewe in late gestation. She's dropping a single in the first column, so she needs 4 pounds of brome alfalfa hay, a pound of barley. My hay, I'm assuming, is good quality, 13 and almost 14% crude protein, 56% TDN. As we go across, the ewe dropping 11.5 pounds single twins, 4 pounds of hay, pound and a half of barley. That take a lot of extra feed for those twins. And if she's dropping 9.5 pound triplets, she needs 3 pounds of brome alfalfa hay and then 2.5 pounds of barley. So I've reduced that hay to minimize my problems with vaginal prolapses. She also should have mineral available and probably have extra vitamin E fed during late gestation and lactation. Oh, I hit the wrong button. All right, there we go. For ewe lambs, late gestation, 120-pound ewe lambs, 2 pounds of hay if she's having a single, 1.5 pounds of barley if she's having twins, a little less than 2 pounds of alfalfa hay, brome hay, and then 2.25 pounds of barley. Again, trace mineral, vitamin E. Generally, I don't full feed hay other than lactation because of waste. If you've got equipment where you can feed TMRs, tub grind the hay, I think it's a really good idea because it reduces your waste probably 25% or more. Lactation rations for ewes. depending on how much the lamb's gaining, I feed a little more alfalfa hay, brome. In this situation, 5.5 pounds. Excuse me, I went too fast. Ewe that's got a lamb gaining a pound a day, she may actually need a little more soybean meal to supplement her crude protein because the hay we're feeding is only 13.5. If you were feeding a really high quality alfalfa hay, she still may not need any soybean meal. You guys still awake out there?
Yes, they are. Hey, if you want to take a couple of questions right now, we have some people that ask.
Good. I need to take a drink of water.
Okay, some people ask some questions about alfalfa pellets.
Okay.
One of them just said, sometimes it's difficult to find alfalfa hay in different seasons in my area. I've seen horse alfalfa cubes at my farm co-op. Can you use these for sheep, or are they too concentrated, etc.? If you do use them, what's the best way to offer them? Do you need to break them apart or add to other food? And then somebody else asked a question just in general, just said, alfalfa pellets, are they as nutritious as the hay? So if you want to address that now, that might be good.
All right, so if you've got those alfalfa cubes, they'll work as a replacement for hay. You don't need to break them up. Sheep will chew them up. What I would worry more about is when you put those cubes out, those ewes are pigs, and they try to eat too fast. They'll tend to bolt them down. They'll choke. You'll think they're going to die. They may actually die. One or two of them choke to death because of the size of those cubes. Okay?
Okay.
The other part about is alfalfa pellets better than hay? The reason for me they're better is there's absolutely no waste with an alfalfa pellet, right? If you get it in the bump without getting knocked down, there's no waste. Now, the protein content, the energy content of the alfalfa pellets is not necessarily the best. So you're probably looking at 15, 16% protein, maybe 50% TDN instead of 52 or 3 or 4 on some of the better quality hays. Again, you can test that, send it in a sample for $15. You know exactly what's in that pellet. Again, on the alfalfa pellets, if you're limiting intake, so you know if the ewes only need 3 pounds a day in maintenance, like we talked about, you put 3 pounds of alfalfa pellets in the feeder, those ewes are going to eat it in about 5 minutes, and they're going to suck it down as fast as possible. So choking's another risk. One of the solutions some people have done is put rocks in the feeder, you know, like 2-inch round rocks, big rocks, so the pellets fall down in amongst the rocks and the sheep have to pick them out. Slows them down. Yeah, it's a pain, I agree, if you got to clean the feeder and we've got rocks, but potential for choking and bolting is really the problem with the cubes or the pellets. Hey, value-wise, feed value-wise, they're probably okay. They may not be quite as good a feed, but they don't waste any, so then you're gaining on alfalfa. But if you buy it by the bag, you're paying $30 a ton just for the sacks.
Okay. Good. And we got one question on your ration here while you have it up here. The question is basically, why barley instead of corn?
Because I already had barley plugged in from the talk I gave up. And I didn't get around to changing it.
Okay.
So, okay, what the difference between barley and corn? Corn's maybe a little more energy dense, a little lower in protein. Wheat and corn are basically the same. Oats and barley are about the same, or actually oats is the lower energy of the two. And that, you know, all of the concentrates work. They do the same thing. They're a little bit different in TDN, but it's not that much.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So here's the next slide has got energy and protein versus lactation milk yield. So if we look at along the bottom axis is the protein content in the ration. You can see with if I only feed that ewe 0.37 pounds of crude protein, she can only produce 4 pounds of milk on 2.5 pounds of hay, or basically 1.2 pounds of TDN. If I improve her protein content, protein balance, her milk production jumps up and it maxes out at almost 6 pounds per day with 0.66 pounds of crude protein. It doesn't keep going up because once we plateau at this value at 6.6, energy is now limiting to that use. Okay? So if we go across to the right, we added a little more energy to the diet. Again, we kick the protein up. We're at the same level, but if we go even more protein with that extra energy, we get another kick. We pick up a little more. And as we kick the energy on up and the protein on up, we get up to almost 7.5 pounds of milk yield per day. The important thing from this slide is that it takes both protein and energy to make milk. You can get a kick with extra protein without feeding more energy. But generally, on most diets, energy is our cheap nutrient versus protein. So you're better off to feed the ewe so she's not losing weight. If she's losing weight, she needs more protein. All right, so we think about being practical, and why do I have this slide where I put this? The top left picture, pile of chopped hay. This is from Northwest. Summer system is to grind the hay, feed low-quality junk hay, poor-quality hay. Basically, the sheep walk to the clean it up the mess. The bottom left picture where you can see my shadow, the thing I love about that picture is there's no hay. One of the first talks I gave in Iowa, feed tomorrow, and there's a lot of sticks in the feeder. You're feeding them too much. And one of my clients looked at me and with all honesty said, you expect me to make them eat the stems? And the key point is you pay the same price for stems as you pay for leaves. The example on the right again shows a bunk with fence line bunk feeding. Bottom right where there is no feed waste. Everything's cleaned up. The ewes are eating it all. And of course, tub grinding the hay is the best way to try to control feed waste. But I will offer you one precaution as we went to net wrap on the hay. If you're feeding a lot of tub ground hay, net wrap, eventually you'll get into problems where you'll get some ewes get full of that polypropylene and they will not be able to eat and they'll basically starve out. So you may have to take the net wrap off of those bales before you grind. Example, this feed long enough to like propylene, so we don't know about that particular site. The thing about protein sources for sheep, there are two sources. There's the intake protein, which the sheep eat. So what's that crude protein that's in grass and hay, in corn and soybean meal in our protein supplement? So that's what we call intake protein. And then there's the microbial protein, or that we get from the bacteria in the rumen, that as they grow and produce, they die off, they move down the tract, and the sheep digest the bacterial protein in the small intestine. As a rule of thumb, we generate about 1.13 pounds of crude protein from microbial protein per pound of TDN we feed. So we think about a set of lambs and the feedlot that are on a high starch diet, high TDN. We're generating lots of microbial protein, so we don't need to worry about those expensive protein sources. On our intake protein, when we think about what the sheep eats, some of it's undegraded intake protein, so it comes in the mouth, goes down the esophagus into the rumen, and it bypasses or escapes digestion in the rumen and gets digested in the small intestine. So the sheep gets to digest it first. Then there's another set of protein, and urea would be 100% degradable intake protein, DIP. It is all solubilized. It's all available to the rumen microbes in the rumen. And obviously we would not feed straight urea because it's too much nitrogen and we get into problems with urea toxicity and ammonia toxification, and we kill off those sheep. When we look at the value of protein sources for undegraded intake protein, or UDP, grass pasture, 6 to 20% crude protein. But almost all of that crude protein is soluble in the rumen, so only 10% escaped or undigested, undegraded intake protein. So the concentration of UIP in grass is 2%. Alfalfa hay is high in protein, but again, most of it is solubilized in the rumen, so we only have 2.7% UIP. Barley is the same, 13% crude protein, 20% UIP. Soybean meal is solvent extracted, which is the norm. 44% crude protein, 25% of it's UIP, so it's only 11% undegraded intake protein. Dry distillers grains, 28% crude protein, half of it's UIP, so it's 15%. The best source of UIP is blood meal, and that would be porcine blood meal, because we've got the ruminant ban. It's 85% crude protein, 80% of it is UIP. So its percentage of UIP is 68%. Now the real problem with blood meal is it's about $1,500 a ton today. So it's a very, very expensive feed. I don't think we can ever utilize blood meal in our rations because I don't think we'll get enough extra performance to justify the cost. Probably distillers grains or corn gluten meal are the two that work, or if you can find expeller, which is squeezed, where they squeeze the oil out of the soybeans, it tends to be a little better source of UIP. Back to some lactation nutrition work. In this case, they added some extra protein to the diet to lactating ewes, 0.18 pounds via urea. They got a kick in extra milk production. If they kicked it on up with 4.44 pounds, urea didn't do it good because there's no integrated intake protein. They get a lot better response to nut meal, and it's just exactly what it sounds. It's made from nuts, soybean meal, or meat and bone meal. Linseed meal, which is from flax seed, fish meal, and blood meal, back to feeds that tend to be higher in UIP. They got a lot bigger kick than they did with our traditional soybean meal. And then if we feed even more protein in this diet, with blood meal and fish meal, we got an additional kick in milk production. This is with medium, small-sized ewes, 150-pounders, grazing twins. The base diet's 2.67 pounds of TDN, and very low in protein at 11.6. So that's why we even got a response to crude protein. Most of our lactation diets should be in that 13% crude protein and up. And if you've got twins and triplets, you may need to be in that 15, 16% crude protein. Vitamin E has been drastically increased relative to its requirements. In the new sheep NRC, I would suggest that you feed 100 IUs per head per day for about in the last 14 days of gestation through the first 35 days of lactation. When we think about vitamin E, it does not cross the placenta. So basically our lambs are born vitamin E deficient. Many of us give vitamin E shots to our baby lambs or give them baby lamb strength. To me, that is labor intensive. If I feed the ewe, it's already in the colostrum, so I don't have to worry about treating the lamb. Many of our mineral tags will have vitamin E listed, but it can only be like 20 parts per million or 10 parts per million E, and that's per pound, and that's way too short in vitamin E. So if you need to feed E, for example, if I'm feeding whole corn, I've got my use on hay and I'm not feeding any grain. You could mix up 20 pounds of your mineral mix with 4 pounds of vitamin E concentrate with 20,000 IUs per pound. And that would get, with an ounce of intake, that gets that 100 IUs of E into those ewes in late gestation lactation. So that's a way to feed more E, and that should help us with some lamb survival problems. Vitamin E is critical to us for immunity, so it can help animals fight off disease better if we aren't compromised with vitamin E status. And my colleague from Montana that's now retired, Dr. Rodney Cott, would say if you have stressful situations during lambing, weather-wise, vitamin E is really critical. If you've got really nice weather, everybody can lamb them and it's no big deal. So because I am not a very good prognosticator of weather, I would always feed a little extra E during late gestation and lactation to try to maximize lamb livability. Iodine is a new feed stuff as well that we've increased on the amount required in late gestation and lactation. The new NRC has it at 0.8 parts per million in the lactation diet. It is required at higher levels under cold stress. So for those of us that winter lamb, it's much more important. So our mineral needs to be at least 140 parts per million with a ½ ounce intake, and most of them are short. You can utilize iodized salt blocks as a way to get extra iodine into those sheep. Stillbirths is one of the examples of an iodine deficiency. Obviously, if we have severe deficiency of iodine, we'll have goiter, and we'll have lambs that will basically be born wolves. So when you think about feeding sheep, nutrients are always important through all phases of production. If we're going to feed our flock correctly, it takes more than one pen. We've got to have adequate protein during mid-gestation for placental development. Our late gestation nutrition sets us up for lactation success, adequate birth weights for high lamb survival. For ewes to lactate properly, they've got to have both protein and energy. And if they're losing weight, they're not maximizing their milk yield or lamb weaning weights. All right, now here's some important closing statements. Sheep have limited to no nutritional wisdom. If you put a bucket of corn in front of a ewe, she'll eat till she's dead. They do not have nutritional wisdom. Sheep do not read fact sheets of the NRC, so it's up to us, the shepherds, to read fact sheets on sheep nutrition. The SID handbook has a great chapter on sheep nutrition. You can go to my university webpage at Iowa State University, and I've got some papers on feeding sheep, feeding lambs, some PowerPoint presentations, as well as the flyer that talks about how to order sheep brands software. All right. And in closing, the next webinar is September 23rd. So let's go to some more questions.
Okay, and I'm going to
really fast.
Yeah, Dan, I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the ones that came up in your latter slides, since they're probably fresher on your mind there. One person said they have experience finishing lambs on rape. Tell me about iodine issues with those type of feeds.
Okay, so when we think about rape, it ties, the iodine is more tied up, so we get into poor problems, so therefore we got to look at using iodized salt, I think, if I remember right. I can't remember the name of the term off the top of my head, but you do have to worry about needing more iodine with rape.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Somebody asked about vitamin E. They said, what is a readily available source for vitamin E, or of vitamin E?
50-pound bag of vitamin E that you buy at the feed store, feed mill. Now, I say that in jest. grass has lots of vitamin E if it's green. Okay? During the grazing season, we don't ever have to worry about supplementing vitamin E. Once we put sheep on harvested feeds, because the vitamin E loses its activity in storage, then we may need to supplement vitamin E. So
Okay.
green pasture is a great source of E.
Okay. And then somebody, I think it's when you had the slide up there with the blood meal and the fish meal.
Yeah.
They asked the question and said, but it is illegal to feed animal-derived products to ruminants due to the scrapie scare. Do you want to go ahead and address that?
It's only illegal to feed ruminant-derived animal products, not porcine, not from pigs. If you can get porcine blood meal, you can feed.
Okay, very good. And this, some questions about different feed choices. One of them asked, what about canola meal?
Okay. Canola meal, I am not very familiar with. I don't know of any problems feeding it. You just got to base it, because you're going to feed canola meal to feed it for protein, right? So you calculate what a pound of protein out of canola meal costs you and calculate it versus soybean meal or any other protein source. But I don't think there's any problems with feeding canola meal that I'm aware of.
Okay. And in terms of corn, what is the value of crushed corn, including cob and shucks?
Okay. If we look at ear corn, a bushel of ear corn is 70 pounds instead of 56. So basically we have 14 pounds of cobs. And the cobs are good for filler. They are virtually non-digestible by the sheep because it's fiber, lignified fiber, mature. They don't get much good out of the cobs. So when we think about feeding ground ear corn, is kind of like feeding a diet that's 85% corn and 15% hay.
Okay. And then somebody else asked about corn gluten meal. Can you add a ballpark amount for that?
Okay, corn gluten meal is like 65% crude protein. It's really high in protein, so you don't need to feed near as much.
Okay.
And it's also really expensive right now, so it may not pencil. Distillers would be a better buy.
Okay, and a couple people asked about kelp meal. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, it's probably way too expensive. Okay, so everybody, at least if I understand right, kelp is basically dried seaweed, right?
Yeah, that's what I understand it to be.
Okay, so if it's dry seaweed, it's full of salt. It's full of iodine. So even though in the Midwest we need to worry about iodine, if we're on the coast, you're East Coast, West Coast, close to the ocean, you get enough iodine from the ocean that you don't have to worry about supplementing along the East and West Coast, or at least not nearly as likely.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with kelp, but it's probably not economical compared to other feeding systems.
Okay.
And mineral sources.
Okay. I'm getting a lot of people firing in kelp comments. So
I'm sure I got at least some people agitated.
Yeah. So a comment was made that they're full of micro minerals and that there's
so is trace mineral salt.
Yeah. And there's something called TASCO for heat stress management. Does that have to do with kelp?
Yes. That data would indicate on heat stress that is a short-term benefit that lasts maybe a week.
Okay. We had a follow-up question on your answer to the vitamin E question. They didn't completely understand what you said there, and they say, where can I buy an edible vitamin E supplement to mix with the mineral as you discussed?
Okay. So when you go to your feed store, go to your feed mill, you want to buy a product called vitamin E concentrate. It's 20,000 IUs per pound. I think the Pipestone catalog has it listed in there. You can buy a vitamin E premix as well, depending on how much you need. Vitamin E, 20,000 IUs should cost about $1 a pound. So a 50-pound bag costs you 50 bucks. And will last you, if you don't have very many sheep, a long time.
Okay, we've had a few questions about alfalfa and grazing alfalfa. One of them asked about bloat block, grazing sheep on standing alfalfa in April through September, worried about bloating, and should they be using a bloat block or something along those lines?
Yes, and the bloat block will help if the ewes eat it at the right level. You have to worry about having too much copper in the bloat block. Make sure it doesn't have added copper in it. One of the tricks is, if you can do this, if you just put soap in your water tank, the soap intake will help break up the froth and the rumen and help do some things with bloat. The ideal thing with bloat management on grazing alfalfa is to let the alfalfa get more mature and get them adapted to it slowly. And if your sheep bloat normally on alfalfa, you're always at high risk. Some people can graze alfalfa and never have a problem. Their alfalfa in their neck of the woods doesn't seem to create that issue. But there's some variety location differences on alfalfa and bloat.
Okay, we've had some questions from folks who are worried about GMOs and corn in particular. Somebody asked,
they really don't want to ask me that question.
Well, I'll try to keep it on the nutrition side. One person said they got some sheep on pasture. They're wondering if it's okay just to, they don't want to feed GMO feed. So how do you feel about using pasture as a sole base sheep feed during the growing season? And what would I need to supplement besides a salt block? And then somebody else asked one similar along those lines, but they were asking specifically about corn and trying to stay away from it, and what would be an alternative that they should consider.
Okay. We're not going to debate the merits of GMOs because I'm not going to win in that case, but that's okay. Sheep are ruminants, right? They grew up eating just grass. So you can run sheep on straight grass, especially managed grass, so you've got 2 to 3 inches for them to graze, and you shouldn't need to supplement much of anything if you're got sheep that are used to just grazing. Okay.
Okay.
And we run a set of ewes here that we don't feed any corn to. They pasture lime in May, and they don't get corn. They're on hay basically hay or pasture year-round.
Okay.
Now, what you do besides corn, if GMOs are an issue, I would expect there is less genetically modified barley, oats out there, but there still may be. And there's just no way to tell whether it is or isn't unless you know the guy that grew it.
Okay, we have kind of an off-the-wall question that came in earlier, another kelp question. But it says, is there any evidence of adding kelp, garlic, apples, cider vinegar, etc. to the diet helps control parasites?
Okay.
Ever heard of anything like that?
Yes. I've done a little work with internal parasite problems. We have parasite-resistant worms that are resistant to some of our anthelmintics here on campus. The best source for parasite knowledge is the Small Ruminant Consortium out of the southeast. Go to the Maryland sheep page and find it. They have a discussion on alternative wormers. None of their data would indicate that garlic, kelp, diatomaceous earth are of any value. We did get a response on our study to copper oxide wire particles, but I only want to use one theory because of copper poisoning. So I would go to that page and do some reading and do some study. That's the best set of research on parasite management, normal versus non-traditional.
Yes, and for those of you that joined us for our webinars last year, you know that we had Dr. Will Getz on it for one, discussing some of those issues. So,
and I didn't say anything different than what Will said.
No, and I invite you all out there to watch that video too and look at those slides. We had a couple of people wanting to follow up on the soap, adding the soap to the water. What kind of soap? Dawn dish soap, Ivory bar soap? What are you talking about?
It doesn't matter what type of soap. Now, if I'm really worried about bloat, I'm going to put bloat blocks out. I'm putting out long-stemmed hay so that they've got some roughage to chew on. They'll help give them a fiber mat to break up that frothy bloat layer. And I'm going to turn them out after the dew's off to get them adjusted to that alfalfa. And if you're rotationally grazing with alfalfa, don't graze the current paddock too tight before you move them to the next one. Because if you do, then you've got them really hungry, and they go to the new paddock and they gorge, and then they bloat. So it's a lot different system than our traditional grazing on non-alfalfa pastures.
Okay. And one other person asked how much soap you had.
I don't have any idea off the top of my head. Sorry.
Okay.
I knew I shouldn't have brought that up.
Oh, that's all right. We got time for one final question, and the question that GMOs came up earlier, and a couple people wanted to type in and clarify that it's not necessarily that they're worried about GMOs themselves, but their customers are demanding that they basically produce without the use of GMOs.
Okay, so you know what I would do to those customers? I'd lie to them.
Well, that aside.
I know that wasn't a really very good answer.
No, but with that aside, some people are asking questions about pasture system versus feedlot system. And do you have an opinion about the difference between the two systems in terms of nutrition and feeding options and stuff?
Okay. The feedlot system's easy, okay, because you're taking the feed to it. You don't have to worry about internal parasites. Lambs in a grazing pasture system are going to gain 2/10 to 3/10 of a pound a day until they get the maturity on them. So you don't get very good performance. So you're going to kill lambs at 9, 10, 11 months of age instead of 4, 5, or 6, depending on when you market your lambs and what weight. Okay? Either system can work. In general, if you're going to go a pasture-based system, it's probably more, it could be actually more expensive because it takes more time. So the economics of those are kind of challenging to come up with off the top of the head.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And one of the listeners was kind enough to send in a link to the sheep and goat website that Dan referred to earlier, so I just sent that out as a chat message to all of you. And I thank the listener for doing that. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and draw this question and answer session to a close. And I want to thank Dan for his excellent presentation and thank all the listeners for joining us. And invite all of you to join us again on September 23rd for our next webinar with Dr. Richard Earhart of Michigan State University. And he's going to be discussing accelerated lambing and potential production gains that can be had from that. And I'm told by several sources that he has that down pat, and he's the leading expert on it. And I think Dan was one of those sources that told me that. So I invite all of you to do that. And once again, I want to thank the American Sheep Industry Association and the Rebuild the Sheep Inventory Committee for providing funding for this evening's webinar. And all of you as registrants for this event should be receiving a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a link to the recording of the event and also to the PowerPoint slides that Dr. Morick will use this evening. So with that, I want to thank you, Dan, and thank all the listeners and viewers out there, and we'll bid you goodwill. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.